What if I told you that a little bit of wet dirt completely rewrote the fate of the 19th century? I know it sounds crazy, but don't be so quick to laugh. You know, history isn't always forged by grand destiny or untouchable genius. Sometimes it literally just comes down to the weather. Welcome to this animated explainer. We're going to unpack the ultimate historical butterfly effect from our source material and see exactly how incredibly mundane elements can completely alter our world.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because this monumental shift in history, we're talking the rise and fall of empires here, it actually all comes down to a delay of just 4 crucial hours. 4 hours that completely changed the map of Europe.
Today, we're exploring the 4 hours of Waterloo, a history of mud. We're going to walk through what actually happened on that battlefield, exactly where things could have easily broken the other way, and just how vastly different our world map might look right now if they had. Let's start with part 1, the race against time, setting the board in 1815. To really grasp the sheer desperation of June 18, 1815, you have to look at it as a ticking clock mechanism. Napoleon Bonaparte is back from exile, and he's got exactly 1 shot to reclaim everything. Across a field near a tiny Belgian village is the Duke of Wellington, commanding this massive coalition army of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops. But the massive variable here? Somewhere to the east, marching straight toward the sound of gunfire, is a Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. So Napoleon doesn't just need to beat Wellington. He needs to beat him before Blücher's forces show up. At dawn, Napoleon is just waiting. Midday hits and his main assault finally begins. But by late afternoon, those Prussian reinforcements arrive. The clock just simply ran out. Which brings us to part 2 and our completely mundane culprit, 4 hours of mud and the undefeated general. Because as it turns out, you can conquer nations, but you absolutely cannot conquer wet dirt. Here's the detail that people almost always skip past. It had rained heavily the entire night before. The ground was just completely soaked, creating this thick, heavy mud right across the fields Napoleon desperately needed his artillery to cross. Napoleon's artillery and cavalry? Formidable. Absolutely legendary. But in this mud, they were effectively stalled. So he delays his main assault by several hours that morning, just waiting for the ground to firm up enough to actually move. And honestly, it seems like a perfectly sensible military choice at the time. You wait for solid ground, and then you strike with your full force. But ultimately, those hours were the whole war.
Now, what's really interesting here is exploring what happens if that ground is actually dry at dawn. Let's look at part 3, if Napoleon had won, the alternate timeline.
We can directly contrast these two realities. In our 1815 reality, wet ground means a late assault, Blücher arrives, and Napoleon suffers a devastating loss at Waterloo. But in the alternate timeline, picture a battle that opens right at dawn instead of waiting until midday. Napoleon's heavy artillery gets to work hours earlier. Now, Wellington's position is definitely strong, but it's not indestructible. Under sustained, brutal pressure, well before those Prussian reinforcements are anywhere close, there is a very real possibility that Wellington's army breaks, and that completely secures Napoleon's immediate political survival.
But, we have to be realistic. We can't fall for the whole myth of a permanent empire. Looking at the power dynamics, even with a win at Waterloo, France was vastly outnumbered. Their isolated resources were just totally dwarfed by the massive total power of the coalition. The rest of the continent still largely wanted Napoleon gone, and he was leading a France that was completely exhausted by 2 decades of almost constant war. Allied armies were still mobilizing, so a Waterloo win wouldn't have meant eternal French domination. It likely would have just bought Napoleon a few months, maybe a year or two, of genuine political survival, time to negotiate from a position of strength rather than just facing total collapse. And this brilliantly illustrates the fascinating downstream effects of even a temporary victory. Think about it. If he breaks Wellington, Napoleon is suddenly the master of Belgium again. The 7th Coalition, which was formed specifically to crush him, doesn't completely collapse, but it fractures. Austria and Russia would suddenly have to rethink pouring all their resources into fighting a victorious Napoleon. Most importantly, the massive Congress of Vienna agreements, which had literally just redrawn the map of Europe, are completely disrupted. A surviving Napoleon reopens borders that, in our timeline, were settled for nearly a century. Oh, and for sure, there is no famous 1815 second exile to St. Helena. That iconic ending to Napoleon's story, it just simply doesn't happen.
But mud wasn't the only deciding factor that day. Let's zoom all the way in from the grand map of Europe down to a single building for part 4, the farmhouse opening, a second knife's edge.
So there's a second massive turning point here that people talk about even less. La Haye Sainte.
It was a fortified farmhouse sitting almost directly in the center of Wellington's line. It became one of the most fiercely contested spots of the entire battle, and its capture created an absolutely critical but incredibly fleeting opportunity for the French.
Let's see how this actually builds on the battlefield and watch this tactical window open up. So, late afternoon, French troops finally capture La Haye Sainte. Because of this, a sudden, glaring gap opens right in the weakened center of Wellington's army. But here is the massive missed opportunity. For a very brief window, Napoleon had a real opening to punch straight through that breach decisively. Had he exploited that exact moment, rather than letting it slip past amid the chaos of a battlefield stretched totally thin, Wellington's entire line could have fractured right then and there, right before the Prussian troops arrived in force.
Which leads us to our final takeaway about how we view the past. Part 5, the fragility of history. It's not destiny, it's just close calls.
Waterloo wasn't decided by destiny, and it wasn't decided by genius. It was decided by mud and a captured farmhouse. We have this really strong tendency to look backward at history and think of it as this inevitable, unbroken chain of events. But when you stand on that battlefield, in the actual hours it was happening in 1815, inevitability is the literal last word you would use. It wasn't one dramatic stroke of genius. It was a string of terrifyingly narrow windows, hours of mud, a delayed assault, a captured farmhouse. Any single one of those, breaking the other way, completely tips the entire battle. It was on a razor's edge. And honestly, that is usually how history actually works.
And that leaves us with this final, provocative thought. If an entire century's geopolitical landscape, the borders of Europe, and the fate of an empire were altered by a rainy morning in a single farmhouse, what fragile, unseen elements are altering the course of our future right now? Take a moment to think about the mundane butterfly effects happening in our modern timeline today.